It was just a regular Friday night after getting out of a long closing shift at work. I made a quick microwave meal, then hopped online with some of my buddies and started gaming. I had an energy drink and some snacks, Max, and was ready to stay up late and enjoy the night. We gamed for a while. I never even checked the time, but at some point there was a knock at first. I just told my friends to hold on as I took my headset off and stood up. But when I turned around from my desk, I realized how dark it was. Inside, and outside, seeing only the light from my computer. I stood there understanding now how completely out of the norm it was for someone want to be at my door this late into the night. And that's when I saw a man looking at me through the window. I froze when I saw him, feeling my stomach drop out of the eeriness of him staring at me. Then the man yelled through the glass, asking me a question, but I was too out of it to understand him. What I said, walking closer to the window. The man repeated himself, asking me if I was someone he knew, named Jake or Jack or something. I didn't catch the name, but it definitely wasn't me. I shook my head no, and the man said nothing as he walked away from the window and disappeared past my front yard, being a bit shaken. I immediately shut the blinds, then went back to the computer and told my friends about what just happened. They all didn't even believe me at first, but I think they heard the shakiness in my voice as they started asking a lot of questions, which only made me even more creeped out. I took their advice, going around and making sure all the doors were locked. Then, also, locking the windows, which I'd never even bothered to do before. Then they assured me everything was okay, and we got back to what we were doing. A couple hours pass, and honestly, I'd completely forgotten about what had happened. I assumed that if they were to do something, it would have been right after he'd shown up. But then a loud knock from behind me almost shook me off my chair. This time, it was definitely from the front door. I told my friends, whispering into the headset. They said to see who it was and just call the cops doing. As they said, I quietly walked over to the door and looked out onto the porch. It was him again, standing there and waiting for me to answer. I watched for a minute, and oddly, he kept looking to his right as if he were looking at something or someone. I backed away and got my phone, calling the cops and whispering to them what was going on. Another knock came as I made my way back to the door and looked out, seeing the man looking off to the side again. Then he made a small gesture with his hand before knocking one more time, but the night was quiet enough for me to hear someone else's footsteps moving around to the side of the house. I followed the sound with my eyes until it stopped right under one of the windows. I saw the glass shift up slightly before getting stuck on the lock and falling back down. They tried again, but the window didn't give in. After this, there was probably a whole minute that went by where I didn't hear anything. I just stood there and listened to the operator updating me on the arrival of the officer as I stared at the window. A loud, dull sound came from outside the window, like something being wedged into the wood. I could see the entire frame around the glass moving as I backed away and tried to think of what to do. But suddenly, a set of footsteps ran from the front door to the side window, followed by both of them running away. Only a moment later, I saw the flashing red and blue lights coming through the windows. As for what happened afterwards, there wasn't much. Police had nothing to really go off of. I gave them a detailed description of one of the men, but that just wasn't then enough. However, it's been over a year since that night, and there's been no signs of them having ever come back. I was 18 at the time, and it was the beginning of summer, so I was off from school, and I didn't have any job. The majority of my time was spent inside the house playing video games, watching YouTube or TV, or just relaxing. When this happened, my parents were out of town for a few days, leaving me with the house. This was a common thing and was never a big deal. Sometimes I'd invite friends over or whatever, but this night I was just enjoying the time to myself. I was watching a rerun of one of my favorite shows on Netflix, while also scrolling through my phone. It was late. I don't know the exact time, but I think maybe 11 or 12. When there was a knock at the front door, I paused the TV and went to see who it was. It almost didn't even register in my mind that it was so late, but thankfully it did. Before I carelessly would have opened the door, I looked in the peephole and saw two men, both wearing similar clothes and just waiting for me to answer. I stood there and thought, for a second, whether or not to let them know I was home by asking what they wanted. I ended up staying quiet and just watching, to wait for them to leave. But a few seconds later, they called out, "Hello, we're here looking to speak with Mr. and Mrs. Ian." That was my parents they were referring to, though I changed the name for privacy. Confused, I still remained quiet, knowing it was far too late for any sort of visit, even if it was important. After a minute, the men looked at each other and said something quietly, then walked off the porch. The outdoor lights were off, so I couldn't see where they went, but I never saw any headlights or cars show up, which had me wondering if they'd walked here, which would only make things weirder. I went back to the TV, but left it on pause for a while so I could hear if they came back. It only took a few minutes until I heard a pair of footsteps outside the house. They went up to the porch, but instead of knocking like they did before they started making their way around to the side of the house, I got up and ran to the back window. As they got to the backyard, I saw them open the fence and enter, and I hid away from the window so I wouldn't be seen. But I could hear them go up to the back door. They started talking, then began messing with the door. I took this as my chance to get my phone and hide inside the garage. I called the police, explaining the possible break-in that was taking place, and after less than a minute, a loud pop sound vibrated through the house, and the back door slid open. Their footsteps went through the house and straight to the stairs. Going up to the bedrooms, a door opened. They entered, then closed it behind them. But after that, there were no more sounds. I waited for a horrifying and slow 10 minutes in silence before the police pulled up to the house. When they did, there was a few quick footsteps upstairs, then the two men started arguing. A few officers came in through the back door and ran upstairs, while another came to the garage and helped me outside. The men didn't resist the rest, but they also didn't speak a word on why they were there, despite weeks going by, and it being somewhat obvious that they weren't simply robbing the house. The only thing they could charge them with was breaking and entering. It scares me, though, that they seem to be looking for my parents, and it almost felt like they were going to wait upstairs for them until they came back from their trip. I think back to whether or not I should have shown myself, and if that would have stopped the break-in. But something about their behavior tells me that they still would have broken in and would have done to me whatever was. When I was 21, I made the poor decision to move out of my parents' house before I could afford a place on my own. It was something I'd actually planned out for months, searching for cheap apartments, roommates, and anything that could help me move out. For some reason, I just prioritized moving out on my own over everything else. After months of searching, I found a post on Facebook about a room for rent in my area. It was a 2-bedroom house, and the owner was renting out the 2nd bedroom. I sent him a message on Facebook and got a reply. In minutes, he asked a couple of questions, then sent over a document. It looked like a huge list of rules for moving in, all simple stuff that's pretty much common sense after agreeing to all the rules. He let me come over to look at the room. That same day when I got there, I was very surprised at how clean and well put together the place was. It looked like it was a model house, so perfectly decorated and furnished. The owner, Terry, was a little bit weird, though he was in his late 20s, but his personality and looks didn't match the way the house looked. He was wearing a dirty t-shirt and just had a weird way of talking. Still, I was blinded by the possibility of moving out that I didn't even care. A week later, I packed up a rental van with my stuff and drove it down to the house. When I walked inside, I almost thought I'd walked into the wrong house. It was so empty. No decorations or furniture, except for an old couch in the living room. It was a completely different looking place than the one I'd seen the first time Terry was standing there, and acted like nothing was different. Talking my ear off about how excited he was to have a roommate. I asked about all the furniture and everything, but he basically ignored my question and just went straight to moving my stuff into the house, being a little weirded out. I still moved in several weeks, went by, and to be honest, I rarely even saw Terry. He was always working, and didn't get home until late at night. But about a month in, I started realizing that Terry had stopped coming home most nights. It was maybe once a week. I'd hear him get home around 2 or 3 a.m. He'd hang around downstairs for a while, then leave and wouldn't show up for another week or so. Part of me didn't care because I was happy to have the house to myself. But another part of me was curious about what he was up to. I mean, he wanted me to move in so bad, but now he's never here. Then, one night at 2 a.m., weeks since I'd last seen Terry, I was woken up to him banging on my bedroom door and yelling my name. I got up and rushed over. Terry was standing in the doorway with sweat dripping from his head and a look of anger. "Do not leave your room," he said in a harsh voice, then grabbed the door and ripped the handle out of my hand, slamming it shut. I stood there in shock, listening to him walk downstairs. I opened the door quietly, and after a few seconds I heard the sound of him dragging something heavy across the floor and into the garage. I ran downstairs to see what was going on. There was a smear of mud and dirt going across the kitchen and leading up to the garage door. I tried to open it, but he somehow locked it from inside. I realized it was best to just remove myself from the situation and ran out to my car, driving away while calling the cops when they got to the house. Terry was already gone, and the smears on the floor had been cleaned up after some days of investigating. It turned out that Terry was actually renting the house from someone else, so I wasn't even allowed to have legally moved in, and all the documents he sent me and had me sign were fake. Terry likely wasn't his real name either, and as far as I know, he never showed back up after that. I don't know for sure what he was up to, but he was so adamant about me staying in my room that night. And with him, vanishing afterward, he clearly had something horrible. He was hiding, but what really confuses me is why he wanted me to move into the house and live with him so badly. I can't help but think that he had some sort of plans for me, and I barely got out of there without having to find out the hard way. The hard way.